In the last lecture, we created a sign-up API to allow users to register to our application from the client and save user details in the database. There, we are saving the password provided by the user during sign-up as the plain text password. But we also learned why we should not be doing that. In this lecture, let's go ahead and let's implement password hashing and salting logic before saving the user details in the database. So let's go to VS Code. Here, let me go and let me close this user controller and this auth module. Let's keep this auth controller here and this auth service. So if I go to pgadmin, they will see that currently we are storing plain password for the user when we are creating that user. But now what we are going to do is we are going to write the logic to hash the password before saving it in the database. And in the last lecture, we learned what do we mean by hashing and salting. So for that, the first thing which we are going to do is we are going to create a hashing provider. So let me go ahead and let me open VS Code built-in terminal. Here I'll select command prompt. Let me delete this PowerShell and let me here clear the terminal as well. Now here what I want is I want to create two providers, a hashing provider and the bcrypt provider. Because as we learned, we are going to use the bcrypt algorithm to hash a password as well as compare two passwords. So let's first go ahead and let's first create a hashing provider. For that, we are going to run this command npx nest. Since we want to generate a provider, I can say generate provider, or in short, I can write it as PR. And then let's specify the path where we want to create that provider. So I want to create it in auth module. Inside that auth module, I want to have a provider folder. And in that provider folder, I want to name the provider file as hashing.provider. Okay. And I don't want to have this hashing provider file inside any other folder. So here I'm going to use this flag ---- flat. And finally, I don't want a spec file for this provider. So for that, I can use another flag ---- no -spec. Let's run this. So as you can see, in the provider folder, a hashing provider.ts file has been created, and it has also updated the auth module. And there, that provider has been provided. So if I scroll up, you see we have this provider folder, and in that we have the hashing provider.ts file. In the same way, I want to create one more provider, and I'm going to name this provider as bcrypt provider. Okay, that also I want to generate inside this provider folder, and I want this file inside the same provider folder. Inside this provider folder, I don't want to create any bcrypt provider folder and inside that generate this file. So that's why I'm using this ---- flat flag, and I don't want to have any spec file for that. So I'm using no spec. Let's go ahead and let's press enter. And now you will see that bcrypt provider.ts file has also been created. You can see it here, and it has also been added in the auth module. So let me close the terminal here and let's go to hashing provider.ts file. Now what I want is I want to have this hashing provider class as an abstract class. And to support this abstract class, we will also have to create another class which will inherit this hashing provider class, this abstract class, and in that class, we will provide the concrete implementation. So in this case, this class is going to be an abstract class, and to make it abstract, we can use this abstract keyword before the class name. And an abstract class is that class which cannot be instantiated directly. An abstract class can be inherited, but it cannot be instantiated. And in this class, I want to have two abstract methods. I want to have a method for hashing the password, and I want to have a method for comparing the password. And both these methods should be abstract methods. So here, let's create a method called hash password. Okay. And here we are not going to specify the implementation for this. So I'm going to use abstract keyword in front of this to make it abstract. So here we do not need to provide the implementation for this method. Any class which is going to inherit from this hashing provider, that class will have to provide a concrete implementation for this method. Now this method will be responsible for hashing a password. So for this method, we are going to get a password, I'm simply going to call it as data, and this data, it is going to be of type string, or it can be a buffer. Okay, now what this method is going to return? This method is going to return a promise. And what type of promise it is going to return? It is going to return a string value. Okay, so this hash password method, it is going to take a string parameter or a buffer parameter, and it is going to return a string value, and it is going to return it using a promise. So this method, it is going to run asynchronously, and it is going to return a promise. In the same way, I also want to have another abstract method. So for that, let me use this abstract keyword, and I'm going to call this method as compare password. This method will be used to compare two password, the plain password and the hashed password. So this method, it is going to take two parameters. The first parameter will be plain password. This is also going to be of type string or buffer. Okay, if you know that you're always going to read a string value, you can simply omit this. You can simply keep the type as string. But if you're going to read the data, let's say the password from a buffer, in that case, you also need to use this buffer. So this method, it is going to take two parameters. The first will be the plain password, and the second will be the hashed password. And in order to make it more readable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it to separate lines to make it more readable. This method is already an abstract method, so here we don't need to provide an implementation for this compare password method. Any class which is going to inherit from this hashing provider, it will have to provide an implementation for this compare password method. So this hash password, it is also going to be of type string or buffer. And what does this method going to return? The return type of this method is again going to be a promise. And what type of data this promise is going to return? It is going to return a Boolean value. Okay, so this compare password method, it will return a Boolean value. And this is the implementation of our abstract hashing provider class. Now let me save the changes here in this file. And now let's go to bcrypt provider. And this bcrypt provider, it is going to inherit from hashing provider abstract class. So for that, here let's say this bcrypt provider class implements hashing provider. And to use this hashing provider, we will have to import it from this file path. All right, now you see we have this red squiggly, and if I hover over this, it says that bcrypt provider incorrectly implements hashing provider class. That's because since this class is inheriting from this hashing provider, it will have to provide the concrete implementation of this hash password method and this compare password method. And that we are going to do in a bit. Now the question is why I'm creating an abstract class like hashing provider and then making this bcrypt provider class implement from this abstract hashing provider. We are doing this because let's say today you want to use the bcrypt algorithm for hashing the password. But in future, you might want to use some other hashing algorithm. So at that time, all you will have to do is you will have to create a class for that particular hashing algorithm, and you will simply implement the hashing provider for that hashing class also. And wherever we want to use the hashing algorithm, there we will simply use the hashing provider class instead of directly using the bcrypt provider class or the new class where you are using the new algorithmic logic. Okay, so in this case, you will not have to change your entire hashing implementation. You will just create another class for the new hashing algorithm, and that class will simply inherit from this hashing provider abstract class. I hope you got the point. All right, now since this bcrypt provider class is implementing this hashing provider, it will have to provide the concrete implementation for hash password and compare password. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Here, let's create a public async method because we know that hash password method, it is going to run asynchronously. It is going to return us a promise. So I'm using this async keyword and I'm going to name it as hash password. So the name should be same. And you see, it has already taken the signature. And here I'm going to call it as password. And then inside this hash password method, we are going to do two things. First, we are going to generate a salt, and then we are going to hash the password. Now, in order to generate the salt and hash the password, as we have learned, we are going to use bcrypt algorithm. And to use bcrypt algorithm, we are going to install a third-party package called bcrypt. So for that, again, let's go ahead and let's open VS Code built-in terminal. And let's go to this command prompt. Here, let me clear the terminal. And here we are going to write npm install, and the package name is bcrypt. Let's press enter. So it is installing that bcrypt package. It has been installed. Let's quickly check that. So for that, I'm going to go to package.json file. And if I scroll down in the dependencies, you see we also have this bcrypt package. So we are going to use this bcrypt package. Let me close the terminal again. Let me also close this package.json file. And here, where we want to use the bcrypt package, we are going to import something from that package. So here, for now, I'll say import all. For that, I can use star from bcrypt. Okay. And here, what we are also going to do is we are going to provide an alias for this star. So for that, we will say as bcrypt. All right. Now using this bcrypt, first we are going to create a salt, and then we are going to hash the password. Now to create a salt on this bcrypt, we have a method called gen_salt. So this is going to generate a salt. Let's go ahead and let's store it in a variable, and also it is going to run asynchronously. This gen_salt method, it is going to run asynchronously. Let's create a variable, and let's go ahead and let's store it in this salt variable. Okay. And in order to hash the password, again, we are going to use this bcrypt object. On that, we have a method called hash. And to this method, first we need to pass the value which we want to hash. In this case, we want to hash this password, which we are going to receive as the parameter. And then we are going to pass the salt. And this is also going to run asynchronously. So let's use await keyword in front of this. And this will return us a hashed password. We simply want to return that hashed password from this method. Okay, now we have this error because we also need to implement another method, which is compare password. So again, let me go ahead and let me create a public async method, and the method name is compare password. And again, as you can see, it has automatically taken the signature. So this method expects a plain password or type string or buffer, and a hashed password, which should be a type string or buffer, and it is going to return a promise of type boolean. Now, how are we going to implement the comparison functionality? That is very simple. All we have to do is on this bcrypt object, we have another method called compare. Okay, and to this compare method, first we need to pass the plain password. So that we have here in the plain password variable, and we need to specify the hashed password with which we want to compare that plain password. Let me copy this. Let me pass it here. Now remember, this compare method, what it is going to is, it is first going to convert this plain password to hash password, and then it is going to do the comparison. And this is because we have learned 2 points about hashing. The first point is, once a string value is hashed, it cannot be changed back to the original string. So that's why we cannot change the hashed password back to its original form. And another point which we learned about hashing is that two same input string values will always result into same hashed value. Okay, so let's say when the user was creating his account, at that time he provided the password as 1234, and this has been hashed to some hash string. Now during login, when the user is going to provide the same password for login, let's say test1234, in that case, when that string will be hashed, it is going to produce the same hashed result, and then those hashed string can be compared. And this comparison is going to return a Boolean value. So if the comparison is successful, it is going to return true. Otherwise, if the comparison was unsuccessful, it is going to return false. So whatever will be the Boolean value, we are going to return that Boolean value from here. And this method, the return type for that was a promise of type Boolean. So as you can see, from here, we are returning a Boolean value. So in this way, these two methods are implemented by this bcrypt provider, which is implementing this abstract class. With this, let's save the changes here. And let's go to the terminal, and there you will see that we have an error. And the error says type of hashing provider is not assignable to type provider. Let's understand why do we have this error. Here, if we go to auth module, there you will see that hashing provider and bcrypt provider has been added to this providers array. Now here, we are getting an error for this hashing provider because hashing provider is not a normal class. It is an abstract class. So we cannot provide it like this. And the reason for that is, as we have learned, abstract classes cannot be instantiated. And this is the reason why we have this error. Now here, the bcrypt provider is actually the class which is implementing the abstract methods of hashing provider, right? So whenever you want to provide a combination of such classes where one is the abstract class and other is the combination of the abstract class, what you can do is you can create an object like this. So let me cut it from here. You can provide an object like this, and in that object you have to specify two properties. The first property will be provide. To this provide, you need to assign your abstract class. In our case, it is hashing provider. And then the other property is use class. And for this use class, you need to specify the class which is implementing the abstract class. In our case, it is bcrypt provider. And with this, if I save the changes and if we go to the terminal, we should not have that error and our application should be building successfully. As you can see, our application is built successfully. And now, in future, instead of this bcrypt provider, if you want to use any other hashing algorithm, what you can do is you can create a class for that should be inheriting from hashing provider. And in that class, you will have to implement hash password method and compare password method. And in those methods, you can use that new algorithm which you want to use. And to apply it to the entire application, you will just have to replace this bcrypt provider with the new class which you have created. Okay. All right. So this is all from this lecture. Now what we are going to do is during the user creation, which we are doing inside this auth service. So from this auth service, we are calling this create user method. And inside this create user method of this user service, we are writing the logic for creating the user. Now, before creating that user, we are going to hash the password of that user using this hashing provider. Let's see how we can do that in our next lecture. This is all from this lecture. If you have any questions from this lecture, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.